Today is a fun day because we get to talk about China. This is different than what we've been doing the rest of the semester. The whole semester we have focused on US economic history, but now we're going just way to the other side of the world and we want to understand China. Why? Well, because China is going to provide an interesting contrast to our understanding of the foundations of business leadership. China is a completely different culture, completely different history. We've been talking about these different models and what contributes to economic growth. The question is China an example of those models, or do we learn different lessons when we go to China? Here's an example. Today, China is a communist country, and we're obviously a market-based democracy, democratic republic, whatever we want to call it. We have a very different set of institutions from China. Yet China is growing into a world business leader. It is quickly becoming, it is at least next to the United States, probably the second most important country in the world, and closing in on that, arguably getting to being the most important country of the world. So we want to make sure we understand China and whether it confirms or invalidates the models that we're talking about. So we're going to do kind of a sweeping history of China starting in the 1950s, kind of up to the present. It's by no means everything that's happening. This is a huge country. There's so many details that we won't be able to cover, but it's going to be a good, fun ride. The history of modern China starts with Mao Zedong. You just cannot explain where they are today without understanding a little bit about who he was. He was the leader of the Chinese Communist Party from 1943 into the 1970s, 1976, and he also is just today has such a conflicted legacy. Some people look at him with reverence, some people look at him just with controversy. And so we're not going to dive into, you'll see where it comes from. Actually, usually people only see one side and they're like, wait, why is he seeing the other way? Let's get into it. The Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949, and their goal was to transform China from a backwards agrarian economy into an industrial leader. The problem is China's agriculture was just not very productive. It wasn't producing enough to feed the country, to feed the needs of an industrializing nation. They really needed to gear up agricultural productivity for them to then start doing industrial productivity. And the government wasn't even trying to improve agricultural productivity. About 8% of its spending was going towards agriculture, whereas 52% of their spending went into industry. But something like over 80% of their workers were in agriculture, yet they weren't doing anything to improve the productivity, which is going to be important as we will see. They begin with a major land reform. They redistribute the land. They take land from people who have it and give it to the people who don't have it. The economic efficiency of this is questionable. The political efficiency of this is incredibly well shown, that when you just give people the land, they sometimes come out in pretty big support of the people who are giving them property. So you see a really big political support from this. And at first it is private property rights. The Chinese Communist Party is giving people private property over the land that they've just taken away from the large landowners. There is some evidence that this redistribution did work, that it did increase agricultural productivity. But there is also this problem that occurs soon thereafter where prices start increasing while output is decreasing. And that is what we would expect in the supply and demand world, right? Supply goes down, prices go up. Yet Mao was just unwilling to accept this reality. This is not how the world should be. We should not have increasing food prices, even if supply is going down. So Mao decides that prices are counterproductive to his communist goals, and what he decides to do is just create communes, create collectives. They collectivize the agriculture. They strip away the private property rights, and property is now owned by the community. And this becomes just the way of life. Everything is owned by the community, not just the land, but the food. You start getting like cafeterias in these areas where that's the only place where you're allowed to eat, and you're not allowed to save the food after you finish. So you are completely dependent on this the government for your living. And there's no migration. You can't leave to another commune if you don't like where you're living. It becomes incredibly restrictive and controlled. Agricultural value under collectivization just drops. The variation here, it's hard to pinpoint where it's coming from, but we just see that the value agricultural output is dropping over these years. Now remember, the government is not focused on agriculture. They are focused on industrialization. So they have this program called agricultural procurement, where they need to feed these people who are in industry. If you are working in a factory to produce steel, you are not producing food. And so you need some way to feed those people. So they just take food from the collectives and give it to the people industrializing. Furthermore, you need equipment. You have to have machines to run your factories. So they're taking this grain and they're using it in international trade to get the equipment they need. So you have people producing food who need to rely on that food, but then you keep taking food from them to get the machines and to feed the laborers who are working on those machines. And they were even storing some of this grain in case of a disaster. The question is, what are these people supposed to eat? They're just having all their food taken away from them. Obviously, they're leaving something for them, but this is going to become a problem. The government's goal for industrialization really amps up in 1957. In November 1957, Mao announces that China will produce more steel than Great Britain in the next 15 years. Sets this big, ambitious goal. China is nowhere near Britain's steel output, but they're gunning for him. They're saying, we're going to do that. And then a year later, he's like, never mind, forget this 15-year goal. We're gonna do this in 1 year. 1 year from today, we will be one of the world's largest steel exporters, producers, even though right now we're not even on the map. So in 1958, the States recruits 21.9 million workers from the agricultural areas to be industrial workers. That is a ton of people. That was twice the size of the industrial labor force in 1957, and 10 million of those came from the agricultural labor force. Not only that, they start recruiting people to make what are called backyard steel furnaces. Basically, melt down the stuff that you own, and we're gonna turn that into steel. Now, of course, the stuff that they own and melting it down in their own backyards, there's no way that the garbage they're producing in their backyard is going to compete on that international market. But this is a full force, we are producing steel effort, and the government gets to control what you do, so you start making steel. One aspect of the Great Leap was the industry side, the other was the agricultural side. The state set these agricultural targets for the communities. They said, this is how much we're expecting you to make, and if you don't reach that, then it's bad news. Now, the bad news was mainly for the government officials working in these areas, and if they didn't make it, they were in for some trouble. So instead of actually making these goals, they realized like it is really hard to verify whether we are making these goals or not. So why don't we just lie? And so these local officials start falsifying the data around their agricultural production. They start saying, oh yeah, we're totally making not only what you said, we're making way more than what you said. So Mao looks at these reports and is like, wow, our Great Leap is going great. We're just producing food like crazy. This is fantastic. So let's suppose that the target was 50 pounds. 50 pounds is obviously too small for a community, but I just need a number to fix to it. You're supposed to create 50 pounds of rice. And you know what? The community does it. They create 70 pounds of rice. This is fantastic. They exceeded their quota and they have extra rice for them to consume themselves. Now, the local official, when he comes back and says, oh, 70 is good, we surpassed our quota, but why don't we just say that we produced 100? What if we doubled our quota? There's no way they're gonna know whether we doubled it or not. Let's go ahead and just report 100. Well, then the central party would come back and be like, wow, you produced 100. That is fantastic. Your quota was 50. Well, let's increase your quota to 60 and just take a little bit more. You still get to keep 40. Don't worry, like you have plenty of food. We just need to take a little bit extra to make sure we can handle all the other things going on in this country. So the government takes 60 instead of 50, which means the community, which used to have 20, now has 10, right? Their food has been cut in half because this local official lied about how much food they had. So you have this combination of really high-powered incentives. If you mess up, you are going to be really hurt. And if you succeed, maybe you're really well rewarded, or at worst, like, at least we don't hurt you. And it's really hard to check these things, so these local officials just start lying, and they say they're producing so much, and the central government's like, wow, we are producing tons. Whereas the people in the communities who are actually doing all the work, they're like, where is our food? Then on top of that, Mao comes up with the 4 Pests campaign. He looks at agriculture and he's like, look at these pests that ruin our agriculture. Now, pests ruin agriculture because they eat it, right? They consume it before people are able to cultivate it or before it's able to come to fruition. And so it reduces agriculture output. We worry about pests on our agriculture all the time. That's what pesticides are for. Therefore, increasing agricultural output. So this is a logical idea. It makes sense that you want to get rid of pests. So the 4 pests are rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. Now, sparrows sounds like a weird one, but the sparrows would come down and they would eat the grain. And so that's why they were a pest. Not quite the pesticide that we think about, but still, they're coming in and eating the grain, and we need to deter these sparrows. So again, it seems logical. But he really takes it to the extreme. And Mao's like, we are going to eliminate every sparrow in this country. We are getting rid of them so that way we can have more agriculture. Now, the problem is sparrows don't just eat grains. They eat bugs too. And without any sparrows there, the bugs are able to multiply and flourish. And the next year, there was just a swarm of locusts descending on their agriculture, devouring it. And that led to lower agriculture output. It completely backfired. That's why these kind of things are so sensitive. You don't want to just go in full force and eliminate every sparrow. You need to think through all of the consequences of the policies that you're implementing. But you can't do that in these kind of situations when there's a central figure that says, this is what we're going to do, and they mobilize immediately and everybody has to listen. You just can't run those kind of policies and not think about what the consequences are. So think about all the ways that the Great Leap Forward is hurting agriculture. You're taking all of these workers out of agriculture and putting them into factories so that way they can work there. You are melting down their tools, their steel, to get steel. I'm putting steel in quotes because I'm not convinced that's what they were creating. They were creating melted metal, but their tools are gone. You create quotas that then people lie about, and then like we don't understand how much food is actually being created in these communities, and then you get rid of the sparrows, which then destroys your agriculture. And then just to top it off, if things weren't 2020 enough back in 1958, there is a drought that occurs, and it makes it really hard to produce. As a result of the Great Leap Forward, we get the Great Famine. The famine lasted from 1958 to 1962. Estimates vary on how many people died. The low end is 15 million and the high end is 45 million deaths from famine. And this varied across the country. So this is the graph for all of China, and it peaked at 25 deaths per 1,000 people. For a normal year in the US, there are about 8.2 deaths per 1,000 people. So this is 3 times a normal death year in the United States. But this is just what it was for the whole country. There are some provinces that are especially hit. This is the Anhui province, I think. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing this correctly, but this is that same graph. That line down there is the same line that I just showed you, but it is dwarfed by the deaths in this province. Their peak is around 60 to 70 deaths per 1,000 people. That is enormous. Now, the consensus on this famine is that it was largely man-made. In fact, it wasn't even that there wasn't enough grain in the country. There was grain around the country, but there was no way to get it to the people who needed it because everybody was lying about how much they had. If there had been more reliable signals from, say, a market, then these people might have been fed. It would have been expensive, but at least the food would have been distributed throughout the country. What's amazing is that in the face of all this, the peasants resort to markets, right? Again, this is where these markets are so important. Markets come in and create value. They give people hope and life. We should always just be so grateful for these markets. So people turn to black markets. They start like selling goods without the government knowing. They're trying to make do with what they have. Mao looks at this and he says, nope, I do not want these. We have specific socialist goals that we're trying to accomplish, and this is undermining them. So he starts stoking class struggle. He starts blaming the elites for all the problems. You know, the elites, the high classes, they're the ones that are causing this famine. He starts getting rid of music and art, religion, and he starts replacing it all with propaganda. Despite all that, he was not able to eradicate the dissidents, and on top of that, the Chinese Communist Party starts pushing back against him and saying, you know what, we don't really like how things are going here, maybe we need to get rid of you. So Mao institutes the Cultural Revolution. This was this idea that they're going to come through and make sure that all these people who are dissenting from the communist ideology are going to return to the true path and stick with the plan. Does some pretty drastic things. He puts loudspeakers in just about every village that just constantly pump out his communist propaganda. He starts encouraging the college students to form up a paramilitary group and to get rid of all of the old customs and culture, saying it's those things that are bringing our country down. We have to just eradicate them if we want to continue to progress. And of course, you start killing off the opposition. The estimates are all over the place. Probably at least 400,000 people died as a result of this, possibly up in the millions. Which brings us to Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping was one of the original leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. He originally was all for that socialist communist goal and saying this is what's going to make our country great. But then he starts seeing the results and he starts rethinking these policies. He's famous for saying it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, if it kills mice, it's a good cat. The idea being it doesn't matter if the policy is communist or capitalist, as long as it's delivering what it's supposed to, it's a good policy. But Mao sees this as a threat. Deng is now possibly moving towards capitalist policies, and Mao's like, no, we are all in on the Communist Party. And so he actually banishes Deng. He sends him to work in a factory, but then in 1974, when Mao is facing more opposition, he brings Deng back thinking, hey, he's gonna be somebody who comes in and saves me from this political opposition. Just a few years later, Mao dies and Deng is in position to take over the Chinese Communist Party. Which brings us to 1978, this glorious moment when there's the secret document that changed China. I recommend a podcast on that. If you haven't listened to it, there's a link in the description. But to give you a summary, it's 1978. There are a bunch of peasants out in their commune and they realize that things just aren't going well. There's no way they're producing as much as they could. They're just in dire straits. They're hungry. It's actually the same province with that death rate that I just showed you that was off the charts. And they're trying to figure out what they're going to do. How are they going to survive through this? They get together and they sign a pact that says they are going to privatize property among them. Even though it's a communal plot, they're going to just assign plots to each other. And they're only going to work that, and anything they produce on that plot, they get to keep. And they have to sign this and say, if we're caught and then I'm taken away and my children are left, like, you have to take care of my children, right? It's this secret document on privatizing property, on moving towards a capitalistic society. They put that experiment to work and suddenly their agriculture thrives. They're working and they're gonna receive the returns of their output. This is what we talked about in that property rights lecture. When you know that you get to keep the fruit of your labor, you put more effort in there. You're more diligent about weeding, about making sure that everything is taken care of. And so these people, because they're invested in the outcome, they start taking care of their property. This is an amazing event. This is so undervalued in our society. We need to be championing these people who are out there seeing that they can start moving their country. They're probably not even thinking of their country, right? They're just thinking, hey, the economics of the situation is not working out. We need to make a change. Well, they make that change, and because their agriculture does well, people start hearing about this. It goes up the party lines and people are like, wait a second, what's going on in this province? They're breaking the rules. Now, Deng is in charge now, and Deng's like, you know what? Black cat, white cat, doesn't matter. Let's see what works. let them keep doing what they're doing and let's see how this works out. As a result, people realize this is something that's much better, and they move out of these communal plots into the household responsibility system, where households are given plots that they own, that at least they own the output of, and they now have an incentive to work on them. And between 1980 and 1982, you went from basically no agriculture produced under private cultivation to like 98%. And then on top of that, the government reduces the quotas and they allow surplus to be sold on the market. They're moving towards market-based reforms, market-based policies, a market-based economy. It's still the Communist Party in charge, but because things were so dire, they start incorporating a lot of market-based policies, and that's when their economy really starts thriving. And it's not just on the properties and the farms. They start privatizing businesses. They start opening up to foreign investment. They have more decentralization. It's not everything being decided by the capital. It's, hey, you guys can make better decisions if you're in your local communities. Let's not have central control. They start reducing trade barriers, and in 2001, they joined the World Trade Organization. All of these things are moving more towards market-based policies and allowing capitalistic policies to come in and help the country survive and thrive. If you look at US and Chinese growth during this time, you see that the US has a nice constant growth rate, but that China after 1980 hits this exponential growth rate where suddenly things just start clicking, things are working, because they're moving away from those communist policies. So just to recap, communism and collectivization wrecked China. It sent it into millions upon millions of deaths. It was just a humane crisis. And then when they switched to the market-based policies, we see them taking off. This is greatly consistent with what we've been talking about this semester, about making sure that we have inclusive institutions where people are allowed to participate in the economy, that property rights stimulate investment. All of these things that we've talked about happened in China. It's naive to look at it and say, oh, it's a communist country and that's why they've succeeded. It was a communist country that failed and then welcomed capitalism, and that's how they were able to get out of it. And in fact, I probably shouldn't speculate on this. There are concerns that they're starting to tip their needle back towards too much communism, and there's concerns about whether they can continue to grow under those conditions. To finish this up, let's talk a little bit about how China's rise is affecting the United States. Now, of course, the global economy is not a zero-sum game. It's not that China rises and the US by default has to fail. China's rise has helped the US. We do a lot of trade with China. A lot of the technology that we have and the things that we get for really cheap are because China supplies us with really good things. So in terms of international trade, this has been fantastic for us, at least in terms of our consumption, right? We get so much benefit from trading with China. Now, that doesn't mean it hasn't come without a cost. That doesn't mean it doesn't come without a cost. Remember when we talked about trade policy, we talked about Stolper-Samuelson, which is this theory that says that somebody will be hurt from trade. Even though the gains from trade are large enough to overwhelm the costs of trade, there are people who are still hurt by that trade. And we have seen that in the United States. There's a really clever way that we can look at this. Remember, we're interested in counterfactuals. We want to know places that are similar in many ways, but different just in the fact that they were affected differently by this treatment. So we can look at the United States and we can look at how exposed they were to competition with China. What do I mean by exposed? I mean, people who were producing the type of things that were then shipped overseas to China to be produced by them. There's a lot of variation in this across the country. Here's a map where it shows these are the darker areas are more affected by competition with China. They're more likely to produce the things that are also being produced in China. And you see that there's a lot of variation across the country and even within states. Some places are affected more than others. A lot of papers have looked at the United States along this margin, and they found a lot of negative effects from trading with China. A no-brainer is that increasing trade with China has led to a decrease in manufacturing employment in these areas. But something that's a little surprising is that there's higher unemployment. Now you might say, well, isn't that what you just said by losing employment? No, losing employment means that they leave manufacturing and we would expect them to go to other jobs. That's what these trade models say. But it turns out it's really hard for them to find those other jobs. That it's not, they can't always go to the places where they are, or our industries aren't suited for those skill levels. And so we see higher unemployment. Now, it's usually men who have higher unemployment. Women don't seem to be affected as much. It seems that women are able to transition and find other jobs, but men aren't finding those jobs. But it turns out this then affects other parts of life. We're seeing marital rates go down because you have a lot of unemployed men, you have employed women, and you have these women who don't want to get married to men who can't get a job. You're seeing some of the political polarization. We've seen that these areas that are more exposed to trade with China are the ones that go more towards political extremes in our elections. It's interesting to see how this trade with China has gone in and affected a lot of things in our country that we might not have realized, that we might not have predicted beforehand. We know that some people were going to lose out, but we would have anticipated that people switched and adjusted. It doesn't seem like those adjustments are happening. So while for most people, trade with China has delivered a lot of benefits, for some people, there have been heavy, real costs. On the other hand, we can't ignore how successful China is. Not because of how it's competing with the US. This is not a zero-sum game. The amazing thing is, because of China's rise, 800 million people have escaped poverty, a lot of them living in China. But this is amazing. This is growth and prosperity. And the fact that we have 800 million people, that's over twice the size of the United States, leaving poverty, that is not something we should take for granted. That's something we should appreciate, and we should recognize the role of markets, exchange, and trade in creating that.